Good evening. How's everyone tonight? Good, good. By the way, be very happy they applauded because you haven't even said anything. It's a lively crowd for you. Tonight's a wonderful night. Again, our distinguished lecture series continues with a very special guest, a man with an incredibly rich history. Before I get to that, for those of you who are wondering what's going on this week, we have this little thing called commencement. About 458 students are graduating, one of the largest classes we've had, yeah. So if you have a loved one, I look forward to seeing you on Friday evening. We moved it to the evening so it's a little cooler, and we'll be out on the football field, so should be plenty of seating. So tonight we have a wonderful guest, came all the way from the eastern part of the coast kind of thing. Has had an amazing career. He was attending college at Bucknell and is originally from South Carolina. And he was about 3 years in when the call of Vietnam came upon him. And he actually wanted to go and serve his country. There's a rich history of that. In 1966, he began his career with the U.S. Army and went off to fly for our country in Vietnam, and has quite a number of very colorful stories about that experience. Came back and continued to serve his country, and ultimately he gets a call from a then National Security Advisor by the name of, the call was for Colin Powell, who was working in the Reagan administration at the time. And one thing leads to another. Powell is duly impressed. By this time, Colonel Wilkerson was not wanting to go to work for Powell. They had nothing to do with it. But duty continued to call. And that embarked on a 16-year relationship with Colin Powell up until the time of his death. And through that, of course, Powell becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and becomes Secretary of State. Of course, was involved in the Gulf Wars. And paths got finally along the way. He ultimately hears, and Colonel Wilkerson ultimately hears about Valerie Plame and her then husband Joe Wilson, and that of course creates some other things, because you may recall that General Powell gave a presentation about weapons of mass destruction. But you won't have ever met perhaps two more men with integrity than Colonel Wilkerson and General Powell. And so tonight you get to hear, as for the conservatives in here, there's one of you in here I think, Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. And of course, interviewing him is my wonderful wife, Valerie Plame. I assume by now most of you have known her, perhaps met her, and she herself has had an amazing history in terms of the CIA and the outing of her as a spy. And I always call her the spy who loves me. And so, without further ado, I turn it over to Valerie Plame and Colonel Larry Wilkerson.
Thank you. Thank you to Joe. He just came from athletic awards dinner. This is a crazy week for all of us, and thank you to our audience for coming this evening. Larry came, as you know, it's not easy to get to Silver City, and coming from the East Coast in one day, it was a trick, but he made it. And it has been my honor and privilege to have some really interesting conversations with him over the last 24 hours. He is someone that I've admired and have great respect for through the years. I can't even remember I think he first met Joe Wilson. And in fact, this morning over coffee at the Tranquil Buzz, we compared notes about Colin Powell's famous speech before the UN, before the invasion of Iraq. Turns out we both felt that our assumptions were at least validated in the other. So I am absolutely delighted to have him here this evening. This is just a continuation of a conversation we've been having over as I say, the last 24 hours. I have so many questions for him. We'll chat for about, mostly Larry will be talking for the next half hour, 30 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you for Q&A, because what he has seen and observed and continues to be engaged in the big picture stuff, geopolitical, democracy. He has seen and sat with most presidents and dictators and in the, as they call it, the corridors of power in Washington. And just hearing his take on where we are now is absolutely fascinating. So thank you for joining us, Colonel Wilkerson. I am so glad you're here. Let's just start with, Joe gave a little, very brief bio on you, but over to you to how do you like to explain where you are, how you got here, and what you're doing now?
Let me take a moment, please, to say how grateful I am to President Joe Shepard, First Lady Valerie Plame, and to the faculty and staff, administrators, students. I wish there were some here. I guess there are one or two out there somewhere. And to the people I've met from Silver City. The hospitality, the cooking, the whole place has just been, it's blown me away. New Mexico is a fine place. And I got to tell you, I've been to Albuquerque and Santa Fe and maybe one or two other places for brief times. This is a great place. I know you have some economic hard times, just like all of rural America today, which is a shame. I'm from rural America. The town I was born in Gaffney, probably had maybe 10,000 people at its height. It's a little bigger now. And it features such people as Lindsey Graham, whom I find excoriatingly stupid. So, you know, it's a different kind of state these days. But I really want to thank you, all of you, and all of you who've come tonight. Thank you very much.
Very good. It means a lot to, Larry and I have spent our lives thinking about these issues of war and peace and the nuclear threat, and to have people show up that are interested in a smaller town means a lot to us, and particularly as our democracy is grappling in some of the most challenging times this country has ever faced. Maybe we should begin there with the threats you see. Where are they coming from, and is there any way of fixing it?
That's the question of the day in Washington. It's on everyone's lips, even if they don't express it outright. Even some of the members of Congress, and I was telling Val, I just testified before the Personnel Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I hadn't been on the Hill in a couple of years, and I was shocked. I was really shocked at three things: the stupidity of the members who were asking me the questions, the venality of the members who were asking me the questions, and before I go any further, I'll tell you that the whole hearing was about the ethics now prevalent in the Department of Defense, your Department of Defense. It does not belong to the Congress. It belongs to you. It's your security apparatus. And we have former four-star generals, three-star generals, and one director of the National Security Agency who now for 7 and 8 and 10-digit even figures are working for Saudi Arabia. That should bother you. And yet these members of Congress of both parties, although the Democrats were a little bit more willing to listen to us than the Republicans, who just tried to excoriate us from the very start, they didn't think that was a problem. They didn't think it was a problem when I told them that in World War II, when we had 12 million men under, and they were all men basically then, if you throw the women who were in the Nurses Corps and WACs and other things like that, it's over 12 million. Under arms, 12 million Americans under arms to prosecute a war on two fronts. We had a ratio of troops, rank and file, to generals of 1 to 6,000. Today it's 1 to 1,400. And we're only 2 million people in the entire armed forces, National Guard, Reserve component, everything. That is bloat of the first order. And guess what the retirement pay for these guys is who go to work for Saudi Arabia for millions of dollars? It's enough to keep you and me in high cotton for the rest of our lives. Because the retirement pay, when Colin Powell retired, his retirement pay every month was $144,000. It's double that now. That's what is happening in your Defense Department. So I have very little respect for those dudes over there on the Hill now. They are composed basically of self-serving, we call them self-licking ice cream cones. Yeah. They're there for the power and the money in that order.
Are there no regulations in place for a retired flag rank officer to go work for a foreign entity?
There
I mean,
are.
there has to be something.
They are. The reason Senator Warren from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, who's chairman of the Personnel Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee, called the hearing to review that legislation. Indeed, the people following us in that hearing were the general counsels, the most powerful lawyers, if you will, in each of the services, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, and such, and the Space Force, which is now a rip-roaring 2,342 people. Big force. And she had an opening statement that was a decent opening statement. She said the ethics in the Pentagon seemed to be a little ragged. And then she started citing all these people who are working for foreign powers, working for Lockheed Martin, working for Raytheon. Indeed, Elizabeth Warren at one time, because of jobs in Massachusetts, was more or less a fan of the greatest boondoggle in American history, in my view, in terms of defense contractors. It's called the F-35 Strike Fighter. It's cost well over a couple of $1 trillion already, and it's still not flying at a 50% operational ready rate yet in any of its versions, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. In other words, it's a pig in a poke, but it's a very expensive pig in a poke. So she began by kind of talking about the people who are in the Air Force working in the Pentagon as colonels or brigadiers or two-star generals, working on the F-35 and knowing that the problems are just manifest in that program, costing you, the taxpayer, lots of money. The logistics package alone for it is near $1 trillion all by itself. And then going out to work for Lockheed, knowing full well what they were doing inside the Pentagon to cover this up from the American people, and now they're going to Lockheed to take their seat to work for the defense contractor. And there's one reason why Lockheed hires these people. They want their Rolodex, we used to say. Now it's your cell phone contact list.
Those kids, they have no idea what a Rolodex is.
Yeah. My kids have no idea what Colin Powell was anymore.
Yeah, right.
I wasn't born at 9/11, one said to me recently. Okay, I understand that. Times have changed.
You had mentioned sometime today the RAP, the design of that, for the tank. Wasn't that the MRAP?
Right.
Can you just briefly mention that as an example of?
Yes. The Marines created a vehicle called an MRAP. You've seen it probably if you've seen any of the video on Afghanistan from time to time. It was basically to take care of the threat of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, which is really just a handmade mine or bomb. And the Taliban, and for that matter, the Iraqis also, became very proficient at killing our soldiers and hurting them badly with traumatic brain injury and so forth by exploding these things when their vehicles would come down the road. So the Marine Corps invented this MRAP in order to deal with this. It could take all kinds of explosions and still keep going. Well, my son-in-law, a member of the Montgomery County Police Force, North Washington, D.C., and portions of Maryland, is the MRAP professional for that police force. And one of the first things Jim did, he's very, very astute and very conscientious policeman. He goes out and he does a thorough inspection of the MRAP because he's going to be responsible for this thing, and civilians may wind up being in its, in its killing zones and such. And so he finds out there's a little hole with a plug in it in the bottom of the MRAP, that it was designed that way. And so you're in this incredible $1 million a piece, You're in this incredibly armored vehicle designed to withstand mines and IEDs. And he says, all you got to do if you're a terrorist, and you know this, and you can look up the specs on the internet, is come up, unplug that, and just fill it full of CS gas or something more lethal, and you've killed everyone on board. So the first thing he did was solder that baby shut. He said, they couldn't figure that out, the people who made this vehicle?
Yeah, multi-million contracts. Let's turn, if you might, to Ukraine. And we're more than a year into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We both expressed our absolute astonishment at a certain portion of the Republican Party that seems to be rooting for Russia and that they are the victims in all of this. But that aside, you take it wherever you want, but to, as I think General Petraeus said as he sat in Iraq, tell me where this ends.
Well, good question. I can tell you where I think it's going to end, and it's not good, or I can tell you where I think it might end if we're conscientious and go after it quickly and very professionally, and it's better. Not good, but it's better. There are people in Washington right now who are saying we're making a lot of money off that war. We are. The defense contractors are making something like $2 billion, $3 billion almost every week off this war. It's a cash cow for them. We're selling all kinds of munitions. We're selling so many munitions to the Ukrainian armed forces that we've bled down our own stocks. So now we have real problems with ammunition for our own military. That's sobered some people up a little bit. But the real problem is we're sitting at a point where a stalemate has occurred, regardless of this business of the Ukrainians mounting a major offensive soon. They may try, but they're going to bleed themselves even more on the Russian echelon defense if they do. So this stalemate is killing people every day. It's destroying property, it's destroying infrastructure, and yet we've hoisted ourselves on our own political petard, as it were, both in Moscow and Washington. Joe Biden cannot admit we say in the military, he cannot show any ankle on Ukraine, because if he does, he's afraid he won't get elected again, because the media in our country has made this such a cause célèbre. It's almost as good as Kim Kardashian. The Ukrainians are white, they're Christian, they're worth supporting. They're not brown, they're not black, they're not Muslims, they're worth supporting. That's the way the media has come across, and it's so bad in Washington that I won't even talk to them anymore. They are warmongers. They're warmongers just like William Randolph Hearst's press was. And we made Citizen Kane, if you're familiar with that movie, and that's a very good movie, and it predicts and shows exactly what happens when you have media like that. And that's what's happened. So Biden is hoist on that in the domestic political sense. He dare not back off Ukraine in any way that's perceptive to the American people because he won't get reelected. I'm sure that's the way he's thinking. Putin, on the other hand, in a very different political environment, which you're probably familiar with, it's very authoritarian, it's not very democratic at all. Putin is at a point now where he has so much invested in this war with no real success to show for it and a lot of casualties to show for it, that were he to make concessions in any kind of negotiation, if we could get to them, would probably cost him his job and maybe his life. And the people who are waiting in the wings to do that to him are not people who want to make peace. They're people who want to beat the hell out of Ukraine and maybe even use nuclear weapons. So it's not a good situation. And yet, the only solution is to face that on both sides and go into some kind of diplomatic negotiation and end this stalemate, maybe create a demilitarized zone like we did in Korea, make it a big wide one, make it policed by other people's forces, maybe some of NATO's forces too, maybe some Russian forces in a demilitarized zone to keep it apart, and then do the things that you have to do. And the essentials are there. And I know Americans hate to talk this way, but it's there for the doing, and there are people in the government who know this. You first got to recognize that Russia has sovereignty over Crimea, period. That's a done deal. You're not going to take Crimea back without exchanging nuclear weapons. But for that, you say to Mr. Putin in your negotiations, you recognize Kosovo. Where is Kosovo? Well, that's that little country that we bombed the Serbs for 78 straight days under Bill Clinton in order to make a country. And it is trying to be a country. If you haven't seen anything on Kosovo in a long time, get the current edition of National Geographic magazine. There is a really good story in there about the Kosovars and what they're trying to do. Well, why do I say get Putin to recognize Kosovo? Because of the Serbs and their desire to reattack Kosovo and take it all, and the Serbs being a Moscow client, if you will, he's got people in northern Kosovo. So you have a bridge there called the New Bridge and the Ibar River, and you have about 80,000 Albanians, Kosovars in the south, who can't cross that bridge into the north part of their own country, Mitrovica it's called, and you have about, somewhere around 50,000 Serbs who aren't going to go across the bridge and into the south because they know they'll be killed if they do that. So it's a very torturous situation. The UN is there trying to manage it, but it's going to explode at any moment, and we'll have another war in the Balkans. You say to Putin, you recognize it, and you get out. That's your exchange for our saying we recognize your sovereignty over Crimea. And then for the oblasts in the eastern part of Ukraine, you hold referenda. And you say, man, let's say 60%. If 60% of the people in those oblasts vote for neutrality, they're neutral. If they vote for affiliation with Moscow, that's who they're affiliated with. If they vote for sovereignty in Ukraine, that's who they're affiliated with, Kyiv. There's ways out of this. And if you continue this stalemate and you bleed Ukraine much more than it's already bled, there won't be an army. And so you will have to put your forces on the ground, whether you're Germany, France, the United States, or whatever. And I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count, who will be the dominant power there. And you'll risk nuclear war. If you stay another year or another 2 years, like some people are recommending, until everyone's so bled white that they give up on both sides, you got to have escalation control that whole time. You got to keep them from shooting nuclear weapons. We are probably right now, at this moment, in a more dangerous situation with the potential for a nuclear war than we have been since Cuba in 1962 or Berlin in 1961. In fact, I think it's more dangerous. And a lot of my friends in Washington who know what I'm talking about with regard to nuclear weapons think the same way. And they're scared that we are going to let this genie out of the bottle and we're going to have a nuclear exchange. Then, if our escalation theory is right, in for a penny, in for a pound, we're going to exchange nuclear weapons on each other's homelands. That is the end. In all practical reasoning, that's the end. We'll have a nuclear winter for 5 or 6 years. We won't be able to raise crops. I don't need to tell you what it'd be like if we had a general nuclear exchange. And here's the other thing that really angers me when I think about it. In 1991 and 92, when the Cold War ended and H.W. Bush, the last experienced president we had in the White House, and I mean that, was the architect of the rapprochement between Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, Kohl, Mitterrand in France, and us here in this country. We made a bargain. We will destroy your nuclear warheads. We had 75,000 nuclear warheads at that time. We brought that total down. In that feat of real good diplomacy, we brought that total down to about 5,000 or 6,000 on each side, which is what we have now. That was an incredible feat. Now we've reversed it. We've reversed it. Your country, my country, destroyed every single nuclear weapons treaty. My president, George Bush, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and then subsequent presidents, including Donald Trump, everything else. And now this war in Ukraine has ended the last one, the New START treaty, which was strategic weapons. We have no nuclear weapons treaties anymore, and we have new aspirant states. South Korea has just maybe been talked out of it by our transferring nuclear weapons back to the peninsula, which is dangerous. And maybe some other countries, Saudi Arabia would buy one from Pakistan overnight if Iran developed one. And it's looking very much like Iran might make the decision and develop one. So we're getting into a situation which is very dangerous, and here's the other worrisome factor. No one really remembers the Cold War. No one thinks about the Cold War anymore. My students, when I show them a pamphlet that the military, official pamphlet handed out in 1969 about how to build a bomb shelter in your backyard, they think it's a joke. They actually think that's a joke. The president didn't sign that, did he? Yes. The president signed this document. It came out as an official document. This is how worried we were in those years. We've lost that concern, I think. I mean, everywhere I go in the country, people just don't seem to have that concern anymore. They should, because we're as close to an exchange of these incredibly devastating weapons as we've ever been in their lifetime.
Jerry, I want to go back to that because that's something I'm passionate about. But first, let me go back to your remarks on Ukraine. I've got two questions. How is Ukraine affording billions of dollars a week or month to buy these armaments? Or foreign reserves have to be depleted. And then secondly, I always think diplomacy should be, you have to completely explore that before going to the alternative of war. And I hope you are correct that Putin would come to the table. But given Putin's rhetoric over the last couple years in the lead up to this, of what he has sold his domestic audience, these are Nazis, these are real Russians living there, we're freeing them and so forth, and furthermore, it's the West's fault. There doesn't seem to me to be a whole lot of, he's left himself no off-ramp. So, and even going to the table, I think, risks his position, his power.
Yeah.
So what possibly could be an inducement to get him to the negotiating table? Other than, I mean, right now he's literally throwing bodies into the maw of war. And he can do that for a little bit longer.
Well, you know, there's a gentleman by the name of Sergei Lavrov. He's the foreign minister for Russia and has been the foreign minister for a long time. Unlike us, other countries sometimes leave their secretaries of state in there for a long time. Sergei was one of the ministers in the world that Colin Powell had the greatest respect for. He used to talk to him on the telephone every day. In fact, the NSA got some intercepts of Powell, showed them to him and said, "What are you doing talking on your cell phone to Sergei Lavrov?" Powell said, "I'm conducting diplomacy out of my office." Sergei works for Mother Russia. He does not work for Vladimir Putin. He doesn't work for the man in the Kremlin. He works for Mother Russia. Sergei, and for this matter too, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, I know pretty well. I used to meet with him when he was the director of their North American department in their embassy, is a very astute diplomat too. They're probably the two finest diplomats in the world today. Wang Yi has been working seriously on talking Moscow, and Sergei is his mouthpiece, if you will, to negotiate and giving them plans on how to do it and how China would be a good offices, if you will, along with others like Oman. Oman has been trying to do this too. Sergei would probably be able to convince Putin that it was in his best interest to come to the negotiating table if what our diplomats were to tell Sergei was the right recipe. And diplomacy in this case, and most often I learned, is not about win-win. It's about lose-lose, but not too badly on either side. And that's what you'd be doing here. You'd be trying to stop this brutal war in the heart of Europe, which has the prospects of spinning out of control at any moment, and particularly with nuclear weapons. There are people on the other side, if you will, in Moscow, who would not hesitate to implement Russian doctrine as it has been practiced since 2013 in their field exercises. They say in their doctrine, published doctrine, if there is and they call it orange force, like we call them blue force or whatever, if there is an orange force penetration into the CSTO, which is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, that's the group that Moscow founded at the end of the Cold War that replicates NATO on the other side, if you will. If there's an incursion by NATO into CSTO territory, tactical nuclear weapons will be used to seal off the penetration and to hit its flanks. And they call this theory the theory of de-escalation by escalation. Well, in other words, they expect when they use nukes, everyone on the other side will be so cowed, they'll go to the negotiating table. That's not what we learned during the Cold War.
Yeah.
We learned escalation was escalation, and you didn't ever want to let it get out of control. And that's what I think would happen, not what the Russians think would happen.
Do you see on the nuclear threat, I've been involved in counterproliferation efforts for years, and the last few years, if you point out, have been so disappointing because bit by bit, all these guardrails have gone away, the last one being the New START Treaty, Biden's nuclear posture review, a yearly thing that, not yearly, but review that the Pentagon puts out of,
Was a disaster.
It was a disaster, nothing changed. Is there any light in terms of, is there any convening force? Because right now, America's credibility is severely strained, to say the least. But who has the credibility to say we can't continue this? It's not the UN.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a small nonprofit like the Plowshares Fund. Is there any, do you see in Washington any momentum, any juice at all on this issue, or everyone has?
I think everyone's drunk the Kool-Aid. I have a nickname for the administration powerhouse. Winkin', blinkin', nod, nudge is what I call them. Nudge at the end is Victoria Nuland, a neoconservative that is the aspirant to be Tony Blinken's replacement. And she makes Dick Cheney look good. So we've got this crew in Washington right now that I'm not sure that they're capable of doing what's necessary to be done. And worse, they're up against, as I said, two of the finest diplomats in the world. Wang Yi from China and Sergei Lavrov from Moscow. That's not to be anti-American, that's to recognize these men for what they are. And to recognize some other reality too, which we're having a hard time in Washington recognizing. China has a manufacturing capacity now, today, this minute, like the one we had in 1940. We did not beat the Germans and the Japanese on our superior military prowess. It helped. We beat them on our industrial capacity. We supplied Britain, the Free French, every other combatant, including the Soviet Union. When I would show my students the 800,000 wheeled vehicles that we sent into the southern belly of the Soviet Union through the Iran supply line, they would be staggered by it. 800,000, Professor? Yes. And tanks and rail cars. Why did Stalingrad hold out against Paulus's 6th German Army? Partly because we supplied Stalingrad through that line of communications. We fed the world against Hitler. We made 55,000 airplanes in a single year, 7,000 ships in a single year. We couldn't make 40 airplanes or 100 ships in 10 years today. China has that manufacturing capacity now. Sooner or later, we have to have an administration in Washington that understands that and deals with it. And deals with it in a way that is not volatile, not creative of a war, because it's going to be tough. If we have a war with China, they will swallow our army, for example, in the first 30 days. Our army is smaller than the army of Bangladesh. China can put 2 million in the field and then 10 million more in 6 months. China has the capacity to rule that region of the world right now. We would be an interloper, not the main power. So this is a reality that we have to come to grips with. It's not one as a former soldier, 31 years, that I relish admitting, but it is one that we have let happen. We have let the Chinese, we helped them, actually, to become the #1 manufacturing power in the world. It doesn't mean their economy is as big as ours yet. It is in purchasing power parity, probably the most important measure of economic might, but it's not in terms of size. But their manufacturing base, which constitutes their defense base, is able to produce a lot more than we can produce in a shorter period of time. If you've ever seen their fishing fleet, just a third of their fishing fleet arrayed in the South China Sea is 5 times bigger than our Navy. And their fishing fleet is armed. Ask the Filipinos, they'll tell you. Anytime the Chinese intrude on the Filipinos around those reefs that the Filipinos say they claim, one of those boats, or 2 or 3 of them, shows up and the Filipinos beat a fast retreat. The Chinese are dominant in the South China Sea now, which makes our situation with Taiwan very, very dangerous right now. But there are some realities that we've got to face in Washington, and we've got to start correcting if we can. And we've got to start dealing with it in a more collaborative sense. For the biggest challenge coming down the road is the one that Co Barrett talked about from the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration 2 days ago on a Zoom session we had with NOAA. From 1972 to about 1989, we had $1 billion disaster in America based on the climate about once every 82 days. In the last 12 years, we've had one every 18 days. And when she said that, I asked her, what do you think it's going to be in 10 years? She said, probably one every 10 days. That's going to strap our military maximally, because the only logistic, transport, power projection capability we have to deal with these kind of threats, even domestic threats, is in the military. Ask the governor of Texas, idiot that he is. Ask the governor of Florida, idiot that he is. I mean, I'm giving you my political opinion here. I shouldn't do that. But they have had their National Guards in shared relationships to deal with the hurricanes that they've had in the last 5 years. And their National Guards will tell you right now, this is #1 on our agenda. This is the Texas and the Florida National Guard. If you come out here in the West, you'll find out many of your National Guards are being bled to death by fighting fires, floods, and other things. C-130s are falling out of the air. Chinook helicopters are falling out of the air because they're dead tired of all these forest fires. We burned up more acreage in America than we ever have in our history, by millions of acres. The climate crisis is real. It is real. It's in our face. And if we don't cooperate, particularly China, India, the United States, Brazil, if we don't cooperate, hang it up, because our grandchildren will not have a world to live in, probably. Not one that's not in really, really bad shape and very difficult to live in.
Let me ask one last question, and then I'll turn it over to our audience. If you would, talk to us a little bit about Afghanistan and how that ended. Because by and large, the people staffing the Biden administration, they're capable and they're experienced. And I expected, as every American did, a much better ending. And it was a debacle. So much has happened between then and now. People, you know, if we were in normal times, would still be talking about what happened in Afghanistan. But we haven't. We've moved on because there's a crisis a day. But I do want to take the advantage of your visit here to ask what went sideways and just your thoughts on it.
In Iraq and Afghanistan, we had a problem, a real problem. Powell told the president all about it. He said, Mr. President, in 1991, I was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we cut the armed forces of the United States by 25% and the defense industrial base by 28%. Then, after 9/11, we decided we'd do 2 major theaters of war with forces that weren't adequate. And we would put general officers in charge of those theaters whom we didn't expect to do anything other than serve for a tour and come home, promote them, clap them on the back, and say, hey, old fellow, well met, good job. We never had any intent of winning. We didn't even know what winning was. Yeah. So after 20 years in Afghanistan, the military is suddenly ordered to get out by a president who had promised that, and by the way, he actually promised it when he was vice president, that he would end that war. And the first thing he was going to do, if he ever had the power, was just that. And he did it. And the military didn't like it. So they gave him a very, very bad withdrawal. Now, why the president, who's smart enough to realize who did it to him, hasn't fired about a half dozen of those guys is beyond me. Except to say that there is a problem in Washington in the civil-military relationship. And it wasn't just General Milley and Donald Trump going over Lafayette Square to the church, and then General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, understanding he'd made a big error, and going over to National War College and apologizing to all the students for what he'd done. He knew better than that before he ever walked over there. And I'm not trying to point the finger at Milley, because I think he's one of the saving graces in Washington right now with regard to the leadership in the military. But to do that to a sitting president in the way that they did it, and to make that look so bad to the American people, was really a bad operation. And some heads should have rolled.
But none have, right?
None have.
None.
We have not held a general officer, a flag officer, a Navy admiral, a general in the Army or the Marine Corps or the Air Force responsible for failure since Korea. And how many wars have we won? Shouldn't someone's head have rolled? You bet. Anyone in the commercial sector, anyone in venture capital, anyone running something big would have said, "You're out of here, boy," or "Woman, you're out of here." No, we just promoted them and moved them on. This is not the way you run a military that's going to be successful and effective. And you certainly don't run one that challenges a president in such a subtle and dangerous way by creating a fiasco in a theater of war that you have been unsuccessful in for 20 some odd years, and he orders you out. And then you give him that kind of reward. Not good. Yes. Ultimately, yes. There's no way you can escape that. Yes.
I have 1,000 more questions, but let's turn it over to our audience.
And the rules are simple. Raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone. Keep your question short, sweet, to the point, and we'll get through the evening with some wonderful opportunities.
Okay, so shouldn't we be saying that we need to support the Ukraine to end this war quickly? That's all I'm asking.
I got the gist of your comments. While I might feel some of the same things you do about Vladimir Putin, and I might feel some of the things you do about Ukraine, I have a long experience with Ukraine that goes all the way back to Yulia Tymoshenko, Yanukovych, Yevtushenko, and a group of other people who were freaking criminals and running Ukraine. So I have a different view of Ukraine, while I have the same view, roughly, that you have of Russia. But let's just look at it from a military perspective, and not a military perspective that dwells down here, but one up here in the ether that considers things like nuclear weapons. 40 million people in Ukraine, 140 million in Russia, a country of 11 time zones with extraordinary strategic depth, an industrial base that can keep making artillery rounds, missiles, and other things forever, and they're going to fight each other? Who's going to win? Ultimately, the Russians are going to win, because we're not going to get in there with the kind of oomph that's necessary, and I'm not even sure we have it, to beat Russia on our own ground in a defensive situation. So you've got to back up, and you've got to use your head, and you've got to say, how do I stop this? And how do I get the most out of that stop that I can? And you do that basically through diplomacy. And I don't see yet, anyway, I know Bill Burns at the CIA. Get this now, this is the strangest thing in Washington to me right now. The most competent diplomat in the American government is the director of the CIA. Figure that for a minute.
Go figure.
And Bill has done such yeoman service in everything from the war in Kosovo to Iran and the JCPOA and other things, that to put him there, I have to think that the president thought, Well, I need a diplomat there because they really screwed George W. Bush, and I don't want them getting me. And so he put Bill there. But I would still use Bill. I would say, Bill, you have a new mission. And he may already have said this, I don't know. You need to think about how you're going to construct this diplomacy, and we need to get at it. Because just the nuclear weapons alone makes this a different confrontation. Yes. Yeah, okay.
I wonder if you have a comment on a statement that the president, I guess he's the president of France, said, Macron, that France is not a client of the U.S. to do whatever the U.S. says it should do. Does the EU potentially have a role in mediating peace of some kind in this global conflict?
That's an excellent question. And if they had their political act together, you're darn straight they do. But they don't have their political act together, and Macron is one example. So is the Chancellor of Germany. So are a lot of others in the European Union, which now collectively is 740 million people with a GDP the equivalent of ours, $23 trillion last year. But they don't have their political act together. But one of the things that I didn't mention that I would have in this diplomatic package is EU. Guess who's going to rebuild Ukraine when the peace comes? And guess what you're going to rebuild them for? EU membership. Because one of the things we're going to have to tell Putin and his backers in Moscow is there will never be NATO membership for Ukraine. That's going to be a sine qua non of that diplomacy. And once you've done that, you've got to say to Ukraine, okay, you can be a member of the EU, though, as soon as you rebuild your infrastructure and come up to the economic standards the EU demands, and that's your route to the future. Here's another thing that a lot of people don't realize. China's Base Road Initiative was designed to end in Ukraine. Ukraine was going to be the entrepot for the Chinese in Europe. Tell me that's not one of the reasons that we're prosecuting this war with the Ukrainians, because we don't like that. It's also one of the reasons we blew up Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because we didn't want the Germans to get so used to that cheap, clean gas that they stayed on it. So we are now shipping them at 9 times the cost and dirty gas out of the Permian Basin in Texas. You tell me how long that's going to last with the new German Bundestag and the new German Chancellor. Not very long. Take you back to 1989 when I joined Colin Powell in Atlanta, Georgia. And he had just come from being Reagan's National Security Advisor, his final one. And he said to me, LW, you know what's going to happen to the transatlantic relationship, to NATO, and to everything associated with it? Because Francois Mitterrand is gone, Helmut Kohl is gone, Maggie Thatcher's gone, John Major's gone. All the Europeans with their feet in World War II and some knowledge of our sacrifice for them are going to be gone. When that happens, kiss NATO and the transatlantic link goodbye. Well, Ukraine saved that. But for how long? Especially if we're doing to the major power in Europe, Germany, what we're doing to them. How long is that going to last? I'll make a prediction up here. I think NATO is going to start falling apart within 36 months. And it's looking so strong right now. I don't think it is. And the Germans are going to be the heart of that. Woo, did I quiet everybody?
First of all, thank you so much, sir, for being here and helping us with this enlightenment, because it's much more than we hear in public media. And I, for one, really appreciate it. It makes me feel a little bit more secure than I have been doing in the recent history. My question is there anything that is being addressed about any of these issues in our Congress at this time? I see nothing coming out of the United States government It is anything but a fashion show and pop stars. I'm sorry, but I am very disappointed in my government the last couple of years. And is there anything going on that can make us hopeful?
That's as good a characterization as I could make, too. I'm sorry to say. Thank you for your comments. One of the most concerning things I have about the Congress right now is you have a group in the Congress who are hell-bent for war with China. It includes my senator from my home state of South Carolina, Lindsey Graham. It includes almost all of the Freedom Caucus. It includes people who don't have a grip on themselves with regard to what it would take to defend Taiwan, for example. We couldn't possibly defend Taiwan, not without full mobilization, not without a lot of time to get ready to do it, which I think a president with any sense would do. But let's look at that for a moment. I happen to be a member of something called the All-Volunteer Force Forum. Let me tell you about your all-volunteer force. 1/3 of America is so obese that they can't make it into the military. Another third of America in the 18 to 24 age range, draft range, if you will, is not capable intellectually of passing the entrance exam for the armed forces. That leaves all of the services, 1/3 of the 18 to 24-year-olds who pass through the selective service system annually for recruiting. The propensity of those young people to be recruited last year fell off the cliff, 9%. The Army was 15,000 recruits short last year. The Navy is paying 50-year-olds $115,000 signing bonuses. The Air Force is paying fighter pilots, F-15, F-22, F-16, and F-35, $600,000 for a 6-year reenlistment, $500,000, this is up front, this is not overtime, up front in your hand if they'll sign for 9 years. The Marine Corps is the only service that is maintaining its own, but it's very small, so it doesn't have quite the recruiting challenge the other services do. I'm going to a conference as soon as I get home at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania where we're going to talk about this, and frankly, other than conscription, there is no solution. More money is simply not going to do it. Did you see Janet Yellen's report today? $32 trillion is the debt ceiling now. $32 trillion. Think about that for a minute. We don't even know what money is anymore. We just print it. We fought these 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the whole global war on terror on the printing press. We didn't have a war tax. We printed the money to fight these wars. And these bank failures that are happening right now are an indicator of the situation is not too healthy right now. The Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland just put out a report saying there's $32 trillion in the world right now that is unsupported by any hard asset. Most of this is in Chile, Argentina, countries in Southeast Asia and so forth who have debts that are just like our 2007-2008 Great Recession. So it's not a really good time in the world to be implementing full mobilization, conscription, and so forth. I will tell you, there's some congressmen talking about the best thing that could happen to us would be a full-scale war, even if it went nuclear, because that would clean the mess up. That, to me, is a really dangerous outlook. I don't want to clean the mess up with your sons and daughters' lives.
Thank you for being here, Colonel. And I want to thank you for standing tall during the Bush-Cheney administration. There were few that we could look forward to, and you were one of them. Welcome to the birthplace of the bomb.
Yeah.
My question to you is going to be about the modernization program for the nuclear weapons. A little over a year ago in January, Archbishop Wester reminded us that more than 50 years ago, we said we would work to eliminate all nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. Right now, we're embarked on what was touted as a 10-year, $1.7 trillion program to modernize our nuclear weapons, rebuilding all 400 silos, have a new weapon, and have a small little thing, but have plutonium pits produced.
Right.
30 a year up here, 50 a year. Right now, it looks like that's going to be 2 trillion. Looks like that's going to be way more than a decade, if it can be achieved at all. And most reports I see say it's not. I'm an old farm boy. This looks to me like a hog farm.
Yep.
This looks to me like the Pentagon has turned into the biggest pork barrel that you can find. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's not only the Pentagon, it's Department of Energy. It's Bechtel, the main contractor on nuclear waste at Hanford, for example. It's a whole coterie of people who are making lots of money off this. Let's look at the ballistic missiles alone. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry wrote a book called The Button. Ballistic missiles are nothing but a cash cow because they are fixed sites that everyone in the world with the capacity to attack us with nuclear weapons, principally China and Russia, know the geographic coordinates of. So they're going to put 6 or 7 of their missiles on that target everywhere they exist immediately. That's in their war plans, just as our war plans put them on theirs. So why do you have those things? You can't move them around. They're fixed targets. They're going to go. When you talk to somebody up in South Dakota or Wyoming or whatever, you say, do you know that you're a target for about 400 missiles when the war starts? They go, why? Well, because you got those things here. They don't even think about that, but that's what they are. You don't need anything but the submarines, actually. That's all you need. They are enough megatonnage to wipe out the world 4 or 5 times over. And they are, at this point, still, technologically even, invulnerable. You cannot find them, and you cannot kill them fast enough. So you've got enough megatonnage on those submarines to knock out the world several times over. Okay, if you want to have a little backup, maybe some nuclear bombs for the Air Force. And they're pretty safe, and you can move them around so you can't target them. So that's about 1/3 of that $1 trillion that's going to be totally wasted. Totally and utterly wasted. Think of what that could do for healthcare, for schools, you name it, all the things we could spend that money on. And you're right, the cost overruns will be another $1 trillion. So it'll probably be 2 or 3 trillion before you get through. And we're also building something that's extremely dangerous in that new package. And I learned just last week that the President's Nuclear Posture Review considered this, but it didn't eliminate it. We're building a little tactical missile that will go on ballistic missile submarines. Now, my question of the guys on the Hill were, okay, how does a Soviet targeter, Russian targeter now, Chinese targeter, know when the door opens on that Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine that it's not a strategic shot coming at them, it's a tactical shot, which will only go about 600 miles. It doesn't. So if I'm the guy who's got a firearm warning, I'm going to push the button. And when that submarine door opens and that missile comes out, I'm not going to wait to see what kind it is. I'm going to launch. This is extremely dangerous, extremely dangerous. And you're also at the Air Force building a brand new bomber whose sole cost factor, if you will, is the fact that it will penetrate inside defenses and drop its bombs on Russia or China. They want to put a nuclear cruise missile on it. So you ask their planners in the Pentagon, why do you want to do this? This thing's supposed to penetrate. You're spending trillions of dollars on it, so it will penetrate. Why do you need a cruise missile to stand off 600 or 700 miles and shoot? Because we're not sure the bomber will get through. Okay. This is the kind of reasoning that goes on sometimes in that building. Man, I was there, I saw it, and it's walked into a 3-star's office, and he briefed me that we were going to attack Korea, North Korea. We had war plans for that. And we were going to destroy 95% of the North Korean artillery before they could unlimber it and devastate Seoul, where there are about 100,000 Americans living, in addition to 30 million others, including 50,000 Chinese, 50,000 Japanese, and a whole lot of Koreans. And I looked at him and I said, are you kidding me? I was in Vietnam. I know the guarantees you gave me on hitting targets on the ground in Vietnam. You missed at least half the time. And you're going to tell the president you can get 95% of the artillery? Even tell the president of South Korea you guarantee him only 5% of that artillery, 30,000 tubes, is going to fall on Seoul? I wouldn't believe you if I were the president of South Korea. I'd tell you, go away. But that's the kind of reasoning sometimes we have, and we pay dearly for it. We paid for it in Afghanistan and Iraq dearly.
We're going to wrap it up with one more question. We're closing in on the 8 o'clock hour. Colonel Wilkerson will be sticking around because I know some of the rest of you have more questions for him, so he'll stick around afterwards for a little bit. But for right now, our final question.
Hello, Colonel Wilkerson. This is Jason Quimby speaking. I am a former member of the United States Air Force. I deployed to Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Thank you and welcome to Silver City.
You're one of the 1% of 340 million people that have
Evidently so, sir.
actually bore the brunt.
So,
Congratulations, I admire you.
thank you. So my question is, you had mentioned earlier China was in a stance right now essentially mirroring what we were 1945-ish or so. Do you see them going into the progression that we did, where eventually we became a service industry? Or do you think that they're going to continue to violate the anti-dumping clauses and continue to maintain that manufacturing there in China?
That is an excellent question, one that some very smart people are wrestling with not only in Washington, but in London and other places too. The history of the Chinese would indicate that they're really interested in their own region, hegemony there, if you will, and economic success, and they have a real weather eye to their demographic problem and their water problem and their climate change problem, pollution and other things. And so they are very aware of how perilous, how unsteady their success is. If you played on that, and you played on it correctly, and you yourself were convinced your political system, democracy, your economic system, which is now, I call predatory capitalism, is resurrectable in that regard, you'd think that you could win in the long term any kind of strategic competition you had with them, because they have so many problems. They have a demographic problem that they brought on themselves with their one-child policy, but their workforce is going away in the next 30 years. Virtually going away, just as Japan right now is disappearing. You can get a beautiful home in northern Japan right now for $25,000 US. They're disappearing. Every year they go down, 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 down. They will not support immigration. Their women do not want to have children, basically. They want to work, no children. Japan's in real trouble. China's in the same kind of demographic problem. So I think our system is stronger politically and otherwise, although today we might think differently with all the rancor in Washington. It still, in the long term, is going to win out, I think. So why meet them at their own game, if you will, in a place like Taiwan or whatever? Why can't you use diplomacy? Why can't you keep saying what we've been saying for 40 some odd years? We recognize one China and you won't use force against Taiwan, and let that go on as long as it will last. Because in that time period, I think China's going to fall off the pedestal it's on right now in terms of manufacturing, economic strength, and so forth, because of its own weaknesses. Whereas I think we can resurrect ourselves because we have that capacity, but we got to do it.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Valerie Plame for, of course, bringing her good friend, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, to us. Also, keep in mind, many of you are part of the Western Institute of Lifelong Learning. Thank you for your membership and for continuing to support endeavors like this. The National Endowment for the Arts, also want to thank that group for providing financial support. But I want to thank each of you for being here this evening and enjoying an hour with Colonel Wilkerson and hearing about all the latest things that are going to keep you up tonight. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.